The aim of this module is to understand what a macrocycle is and why it might not just be 1 year. The macrocycle is the big cycle, as you can imagine. Microcycle would be the smaller cycle. We look at how it is structured. Now, a macrocycle does not just necessarily mean 1 year. Let's have a quick look at this. Okay, now we get into some of the actual detail of this. Behind my head, you can see what I've written down here is 2022, where this is the year I'm recording this, 23, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, now this, I would argue, is probably more than a macrocycle. This could be the entire longevity of somebody's career at international level. So this would in fact encompass 2 Olympic cycles. So let's say, for example, we are beginning at 2022 now, and we've got someone who we believe is going to be at their physical and their training peak, their chronological peak, around about 2028 Olympics. How do we plan ahead to 2028? How are we going to make a training cycle that's going to get somebody to peak there? And do we need to make compromises in any of the other years? The answer to that is yes, there are going to be some compromises, but we are approaching this with an intelligent plan and a plan of action to bring someone to their peak in 2028. Now, what you've noticed here is what I've done is I've put some dots next to these numbers here. And these dots indicate whether that year is what is going to be called a single or double periodized year. Now, in a single periodized year, this means you have 1 peak. In a double periodized year, yeah, you guessed it, 2 peaks. There are other models. Certainly in rugby and football, you'll find that there can be up to 8 peaks in any 1 year, but there's a huge compromise that what that does not allow is continual improvement over time, and it causes injury. So these models work very, very well, the single and double periodized year, if you're looking for long-term improvement. Now, one thing that has been proven time and time again with athletes is that if you do more than 2 double periodized years in a row, the likelihood of injury increases. Okay, so you'll notice that at no point have I done more than 2 double periodized years in a row. At no point. Usually in the second double periodized year, that's when we get our biggest improvement as well, not in the first double periodized year. So let's have a look at what I've done with this particular model. So if we look at this, you can see that in 2022, it's a double periodized year, then single. Then we've got 2 doubles. We need a single after that. Otherwise, there's a greater likelihood of injury here. Then 2027, we've got a double, and 2028, we've got our second double. And that's going to give us the biggest peak around about here. Okay, here's your basic principle. You can't do this going forwards. Even though I say with every lecture I do, I'm going to begin at the very beginning and then I'm going to work forward. With periodization, you do it in reverse, okay? You begin at the peak and you work backwards. It's very important to do that. Let's have a look at this. So I've decided that the peak is going to be here, 2028. So I've got to have 2 double periodized years working up to that. That means in 2026, working backwards, I must have a single periodized year. I can't do it any other way. Otherwise, chances are they're going to be injured. Then I can go back to 2 double periodized years here, then a single, and then I've got a double here, like this. This pattern is very, very straightforward and it works. There's a little bit of a compromise, as you can see, because what I've done here, essentially what's going to happen here is they're not necessarily going to peak in their first Olympics. Now, the thing is that there are many people who are doing this because a lot of athletes are not winning in their first Olympics these days. There are few that do. Most win on their second Olympics. We talked earlier as well in terms of the percentage loss of maximum aerobic capacity, and of strength over only a 4-week period. Now, let me just give you a little statistic when we're talking about the Olympics. I had a look at quite a few different events in athletics, and athletics is a very pure sport. So it's very easy because it's objectively measured. It's not subjectively measured, such as boxing or gymnastics. Like swimming, it is objectively measured by time, by distance, by height. So we can't argue with the results. Now, what I found was that in very, very few cases was the margin of winning less than 1%. And in very, very few cases, there is the margin of winning greater than 2%. The margin between Olympic gold and Olympic silver is in more than 80% of cases between 1 and 2%. That's it. There's your margin. So that brings us back to the fact that we've got to be very accurate with getting this right. We've got to stay in touch with our speed, our strength, our aerobic capacity. We have to get all of these things in balance. This is why we need to be pretty accurate with this. So this is an example of what many people might call a quadrennial or an Olympic, or in this case, this is a life cycle to an extent. Now let's look at what happens in an annual cycle as part of that macrocycle. Here is an example of one that I've prepared earlier for an amateur boxer during the boxing season, which will run generally September, October through to May. And we've got October, November, December, January, February, March, April and May. Now, that macrocycle is then divided into 3 different types of phase, or mesocycle if you prefer that term. The first is called conditioning. The second is preparation, and the third is technical. Now, to give a brief overview of what these mean, conditioning, this is where you're getting yourself conditioned. You're building up your aerobic base, you're building up those longer runs, you're building up volume. So this is high volume, but lower intensity. So if I were to represent this on a graph, the intensity would be here. So if I were to represent this on a graph, the intensity would be around about here. When we move into preparation, this is where we're working on strength training. So we're going to work on strength training, and we're going to use lower number of repetitions, but at a higher intensity. We're building strength, we're building speed, etc. The intensity is much higher, so I would take this intensity close up to 100% here. When we move then into technical training, this is where we're working on sharpening up. And what we do not want to do at this stage is breaking down tissue. We don't want to be overtraining, overstraining. We want this to be within our capabilities. So when we're doing our technical training, the emphasis is getting good technique and really sharpening up and bringing ourselves to a peak. You'll notice in between each of these sections, I have written into here 1 week of active rest. Some people would call this a deload week. You can call it whatever you prefer, but there is an example of a week off worked into this. Now you can see from that previous close-up before that underneath here, under conditioning, I have written bank, okay? By pure coincidence, this ends up being roughly the same length as a ruler, okay? I want you to bear this in mind, and I want you to write this down because this is so important. This is how I view training, and I have never found an example where I've been proved wrong on this yet, okay? This is where you put money into the bank here. So your conditioning is where you put the money in the bank. Your technical training here is where you're taking money out of the bank. All of that good work, you're beginning to sacrifice staying in touch with those strength, the aerobic capacity, your lactic capability. You're just sacrificing that a little bit to focus on the technique and sharpening up, okay? Now, it's a bit like a seesaw, like this, okay? I haven't mentioned the preparation phase in the middle here. This essentially is your pivot point here, like this. Now, if I have more money in the bank here, like this, I'm not going to get injured. If I take too much money out of the bank and it tilts like this, I will get injured. Right, I can be specific about this. I can look at your program and I can tell you exactly when you or your athlete or your boxer is going to get injured just by looking at how long your conditioning phase is and how long your technical phase is over here. Okay? Now, your conditioning phase, if it is, let's say, for example, 12 weeks long, that's going to give you 12 weeks of technical before you'd get injured, okay? If it is 8 weeks long, it's going to give you 8 weeks of technical before you get injured. It's pretty much that accurate. If you don't do enough conditioning, I can tell you if you do 6 weeks here and you're going to try and do 8 weeks in technical, at 6 weeks in technical, that's when you'll get injured. And it works. It happens. Now the thing is that when we look at these phases, the one that is the pivotal point in this is actually the preparation phase. So this one's quite easy to write. And what we do with the preparation phase is we look at this and we have to kind of gauge it on how long does it take for me to gain maximum speed or maximum power, right? The answer is 16 weeks. But, and there's a big but, that's fine if you're a powerlifter. If you're a powerlifter, you will need a preparation phase of 16 weeks, okay? Anybody else, there's a case of what's called diminishing returns, that it goes up like this and you get a big increase and then less return as time goes on. That time can actually be spent better. Every person is an individual and every person's different, but by and large, you want your preparation phase to be 12 weeks long. That's ideal, okay? 12 weeks there. Just take it from me. The minimum is 8. Don't try and do it on less than that. You won't make much of a gain. It's just going to be counterproductive, okay? So here's your pivot point, and that's going to be 8 weeks. Now, your technical phase, your season, if you like, your competitive season, as you can see there, now that can vary, and in some cases in athletics that season can be 16 weeks long. In other sports it can be longer, and we have to have enough money going in the bank to counterbalance what's happening here. This is why so many football players and rugby players get injured, because they spend so little time in what they call pre-season training and they spend such a long playing season. This is why they get injured, and they have to use an undulating method of periodization in order to continually deload and then build back up. And they'll work, but they never quite achieve that same upward trajectory as someone who is focusing purely on one aspect.